You've probably been there. A tomato plant so huge and leafy it looks like it belongs in a jungle, but when harvest time comes, you're lucky to get a handful of actual tomatoes. Frustrating, right? Today I'm walking you through exactly how to flip that script and grow tons of fruit instead of just pretty leaves. Stop early fertilizing. Here's something most gardeners get wrong right from the start, and it sets them up for disappointment all season long. When you plant your tomatoes, you're probably excited to give them the best start possible. So you grab that fertilizer and start feeding them right away. I get it. I used to do the same thing. But here's what actually happens. You end up with massive plants that are all leaves and stems with barely any tomatoes to show for your effort. The problem is nitrogen. When tomatoes get too much nitrogen early on, they put all their energy into growing foliage. They become these beautiful, lush green monsters that look impressive but don't produce much fruit. Most garden compost and potting soil already has fertilizer mixed in, usually enough to feed your plants for about 4 weeks. If you add more fertilizer on top of that, you're basically telling your tomato plant to focus on leaves, not fruit. So, when should you actually start fertilizing? Wait until you see flowers turning into tiny baby fruits. That's your signal. Once those little tomatoes start forming, that's when your plant needs extra nutrition to support fruit development, not before. And what type of fertilizer should you use? This is crucial. Look for a tomato-specific fertilizer with a high middle number on the package. That middle number represents potassium, which promotes fruiting. You want something like a 5 to 10 to 10 or similar ratio, where the potassium and phosphorus numbers are higher than nitrogen. Products like Tomerite or any liquid tomato feed work perfectly for this. I learned this lesson the hard way years ago. I had this beautiful tomato plant, probably 5 feet tall with the darkest green leaves you've ever seen. I was so proud of it. My neighbour even commented on how healthy it looked, but when everyone else started harvesting tomatoes, mine barely had any flowers. I was feeding it a balanced fertilizer every week, thinking I was doing something great. Turns out I was just growing an ornamental plant. The key is patience. Let your tomato plant establish its root system first, using whatever nutrients are already in your soil. Then when those flowers appear and start setting fruit, that's when you bring in the tomato feed. Apply it every 2 weeks according to the package directions, and you'll see a dramatic difference in fruit production. Think of it this way: early nitrogen is like giving a teenager unlimited video game access before homework is done. Sure, they'll have fun, but they won't accomplish what they're supposed to. Feed your tomatoes at the right time with the right stuff, and they'll reward you with an actual harvest. Remove those suckers. Let me show you the single most important pruning technique that separates a mediocre tomato harvest from an incredible one. Between every leaf and the main stem of your tomato plant, you'll notice little shoots starting to grow. These are called suckers, and if you let them grow unchecked, they'll turn your tomato plant into a sprawling bush that produces way more leaves than fruit. Each sucker wants to become its own full branch, complete with stems, leaves, and eventually some flowers. But here's the problem. All that growth takes energy away from fruit production. Think about it like this. Your tomato plant has a limited amount of energy to work with. Every sucker you leave on the plant is like adding another mouth to feed. The plant has to split its resources between the main stem and all these side branches. What happens? You get tons of foliage but smaller tomatoes and fewer of them overall. Identifying suckers is actually easy once you know what to look for. The main stem runs straight up from the soil. Leaves grow out from the main stem, and right in that little armpit or intersection between the leaf and the main stem, that's where suckers emerge. They look like tiny stems with small leaves at first. Flowers, on the other hand, grow on their own stems directly off the main stem, so you won't confuse them once you know the pattern. The best time to remove suckers is when they're small and tender. I check my plants every other day during peak growing season. When suckers are young, you can simply pinch them off with your thumb and forefinger. Just grab the base of the sucker and snap it off. It takes 2 seconds per plant. If you miss a few and they get thicker, don't panic. Grab a clean pair of pruners and cut them off as close to the main stem as possible. I've had suckers grow nearly as tall as the main stem because I got busy and forgot to check for a week. It happens, just remove them when you notice. Here's a pro tip. When you're at the top of the plant and things look crowded, it can be tricky to tell what's the main stem And what's a sucker? Look for flower clusters. The main stem usually has more developed growth and flower buds forming. If you're unsure, wait a few days and let it grow a bit more. It'll become obvious. Some people feel bad removing all these potential branches, like they're wasting plant material. But trust me, you're not. You're redirecting energy where it matters most, into growing bigger, better tomatoes on a healthier main stem. Once you get into the habit of sucker removal, it becomes second nature. What's your biggest struggle with growing tomatoes? The leafy growth or actually getting fruit? Know your type. Before you start aggressively pruning every tomato plant in sight, you need to understand something critical that'll save you from making a huge mistake. Not all tomato plants grow the same way, and if you prune the wrong type too heavily, you'll actually reduce your harvest instead of increasing it. There are two main types of tomatoes, indeterminate and determinate. I know those sound like fancy botanical terms, but the difference is actually pretty simple, and it completely changes how you should care for your plants. Indeterminate tomatoes are the tall-growing vining types. These plants will keep growing and growing until cold weather or frost kills them. In a long growing season, they can easily reach 10 feet tall or more. They produce fruit continuously throughout the season on the main stem. Think of them like a fruit factory that never shuts down. These are the ones you want to prune aggressively by removing all those suckers we just talked about. Determinate tomatoes, sometimes called bush tomatoes, are totally different. They're genetically programmed to grow to a specific height, usually around 3 to 5 feet, produce all their fruit in a shorter window, and then they're basically done. The plant stops growing on its own. These types actually produce a lot of their fruit on those side shoots, so if you prune them heavily, you're literally cutting off your harvest. Here's where it gets slightly more complicated. Beefsteak tomatoes are kind of a hybrid between the two. They keep growing like indeterminate types, but their side shoots tend to be shorter and produce a decent amount of fruit. With beefsteaks, you want to prune just enough to keep the plant manageable, but not as aggressively as true indeterminate varieties. So how do you know which type you have? Check your seed packet or the plant tag that came with your seedling. It should clearly state whether it's determinate or indeterminate. If you bought plants from a garden centre and the tag is long gone, you can usually tell by watching how they grow. Indeterminate plants just keep reaching for the sky, while determinates will stop at a certain point and start focusing on ripening fruit. Most heirloom tomatoes are indeterminate. Popular varieties like Brandywine, Cherokee Purple and Black Crim all fall into this category. Common determinate varieties include Roma, Celebrity, and many cherry tomato types bred for containers. Why does this matter so much? Because pruning strategy changes everything. For indeterminate tomatoes, aggressive sucker removal means bigger fruit and better air circulation. For determinate tomatoes, removing too many suckers means you're throwing away potential tomatoes. You'll only want to remove lower leaves touching the soil and any damaged or yellowing growth, but leave those side shoots alone. Plant deeply always. Here's something that blows most beginner gardeners' minds, and honestly, it feels wrong the first time you do it. Tomatoes have this incredible superpower that almost no other vegetable has. Those tiny hairs you see all along the stem, every single one of those is a potential root just waiting to touch soil. When they do, they'll start growing roots immediately. This means you can bury a tomato stem way deeper than you'd ever dream of burying other plants. And instead of rotting or dying, it'll create a massive root system that feeds the entire plant better. When I plant tomatoes, I remove leaves from the bottom half to 2/3 of the stem. I know it looks drastic, like you're left with barely any plant, but trust me on this. You want to bury as much of that stem as possible. Dig your hole deep enough that only the top few leaves are showing above ground. That buried portion will explode with roots in just a few days. Why does this matter? A bigger root system means the plant can pull up more water and nutrients from the soil. It's more stable in wind, it's more drought resistant, and most importantly, it can support way more fruit production. Think of roots as the foundation of a building. The stronger and deeper the foundation, the taller and more productive the structure can be. Here's another trick that works like magic. Add rock phosphate to the bottom of your planting hole. Don't mix it into the soil, just put a handful right at the bottom and set your tomato roots directly on top of it. Phosphate promotes incredible root development, And when those roots grow down and make contact with it immediately, you'll see explosive growth within the first 2 weeks. Now let's talk about spacing, because this ties directly into how much you prune. If you're growing indeterminate tomatoes and pruning them to 1 or 2 main stems like we discussed, you can plant them closer together, about 12 to 18 inches apart. The plants stay narrow and vertical, so they don't need as much horizontal space. But if you're growing determinate varieties or you decide not to prune much, give them 2 to 3 feet of space between plants. They'll bush out and need that room. Cramped plants create the perfect environment for disease. Poor air circulation means leaves stay wet longer after watering or rain. Wet leaves equal fungal problems like blight and mildew. Sunlight access matters too. Every part of your plant needs direct sun to photosynthesize and create energy. When plants are too close and overlapping, the shaded portions become weak and unproductive. Space them right from the start, and you'll avoid so many problems down the road. Water smart daily. This might surprise you, but watering incorrectly causes more tomato problems than almost anything else gardeners deal with. You'd think watering would be the easiest part of growing tomatoes, right? Just give them water when the soil looks dry. But the reality is that inconsistent watering creates a cascade of problems that'll ruin your harvest, even if you're doing everything else perfectly. I've seen beautiful healthy plants suddenly develop cracked fruit, blossom end rot, and pest infestations, all because of watering mistakes. Here's what you need to understand. Tomatoes want consistently moist soil, not wet, not dry, but evenly moist. When the soil goes from bone dry to flooding wet, the fruit can't handle it. The tomato has been sitting there slightly dehydrated, and suddenly it gets hit with a massive amount of water. It sucks up as much as it can, faster than the skin can stretch, and boom, you get cracks running down the side of your tomatoes. So how do you know when to water? Use the finger knuckle test. Stick your finger into the soil near your plant. If it's dry down to your second knuckle, about 2 inches deep, it's time to water. If it still feels moist at that depth, wait another day and check again. When you do water, water deeply. I'm talking about a slow, thorough soaking that gets down to the root zone, not a quick splash on the surface. Deep watering encourages roots to grow down deep, where moisture is more consistent. Shallow, frequent watering keeps roots near the surface, where they're vulnerable to heat and drying out. Aim for 1 to 2 deep waterings per week, rather than a little bit every single day. Always water at the base of the plant, never overhead. Tomato leaves are incredibly susceptible to disease, and wet foliage is basically an invitation for fungal problems. When you water from above, you're also splashing soil onto the lower leaves. And soil contains pathogens that cause disease. Use a watering can, hose, or drip irrigation aimed directly at the soil around the roots. Here's something most people don't realize. Blossom end rot, that black rotting spot on the bottom of tomatoes, is usually blamed on calcium deficiency. But the real culprit is inconsistent watering. Calcium exists in your soil, but the plant can't absorb it and transport it to developing fruit without consistent moisture. Fix your watering habits and blossom end rot often disappears on its own. Morning is the best time to water. The plants have all day to dry off if any moisture gets on the leaves, and they're hydrated before the heat of the afternoon hits. If you can only water in the evening, that's okay. Just be extra careful to keep water off the foliage. Clear bottom leaves. Walk through any experienced tomato grower's garden in midsummer, and you'll notice something interesting about their plants. The bottom 2 feet of every tomato plant will be completely bare. No leaves, no branches, just clean stems rising up from the soil. First-time gardeners often think something went wrong or the plant is sick. But this is actually intentional, and it's one of the smartest disease prevention strategies you can use. Lower leaves are disease magnets. They're the closest to the soil where most plant pathogens live. Every time it rains or you water, tiny droplets of soil splash up onto those bottom leaves. That soil carries fungal spores, bacteria, and all sorts of microscopic troublemakers, just waiting for a chance to infect your plant. Once disease takes hold on lower leaves, it spreads upward through the entire plant. Those bottom leaves also tend to stay wet longer than leaves higher up. They're shaded by the rest of the plant, they don't get as much air circulation, and morning dew sits on them for hours. Moisture plus pathogens equals disease every single time. Rust, early blight, and various mildews almost always start at the bottom of the plant and work their way up. Here's what you need to do. Once your tomato plants are established and growing well, start removing the lowest set of leaves. Use clean pruners and cut them off close to the main stem. As the plant continues growing taller, keep removing lower leaves until you have about 2 feet of clearance between the soil and the first remaining leaves. This clearance does a few important things. It prevents that soil splash problem we talked about. It dramatically improves airflow around the base of the plant, which helps everything dry out faster, and it makes it much easier to water at the soil level without accidentally soaking foliage. Don't worry about removing these leaves. By the time your plant is tall enough to need this kind of pruning, there's plenty of green growth up top to handle photosynthesis. The plant doesn't need those bottom leaves anymore. In fact, they're often older, less efficient at making food anyway, and more likely to become a liability than an asset. Pay attention to yellowing leaves anywhere on the plant. Yellow leaves are usually a sign that something's wrong, whether it's disease, nutrient deficiency, or just old age. Don't leave them on the plant hoping they'll recover. They won't. Remove them immediately so the plant can focus energy on healthy growth. I know it feels aggressive at first, especially if you're new to growing tomatoes. You'll look at your plant and think it seems too bare. But give it a week and you'll see vigorous new growth up top, and more importantly, you'll avoid the heartbreak of watching disease destroy your plants right before harvest time. Support plants early. Let me tell you about one of the most common mistakes that causes gardeners to lose entire plants right when they're about to harvest. You plant your tomatoes, they're small and manageable, and you think you've got plenty of time to worry about staking or cages later. Then a few weeks pass, the plant shoots up, and suddenly you're trying to wrestle a 5-foot-tall tomato plant onto a stake without breaking branches. I've snapped off main stems doing this, and let me tell you, there's no coming back from that kind of damage. Support your tomatoes at planting time or within the first week. I cannot stress this enough. When you wait too long, you risk damaging the root system trying to push stakes into the ground near an established plant. You also have a tangled mess of stems and leaves that's nearly impossible to organize onto supports without breaking something important. For indeterminate varieties that grow tall, you need serious support. Simple tomato cages from the garden centre won't cut it. They may be 4 feet tall, and these plants can reach 10 feet or more. I use tall wooden stakes, metal poles, or an overhead trellis system with twine coming down to each plant. The overhead method is my favourite for growing multiple plants because it's cost-effective and supports even the heaviest fruit loads. Here's how the twine system works. String runs from an overhead structure down to each plant. You anchor the bottom end into the soil with a landscape staple or homemade wire stake. As the plant grows, you either twist the main stem around the twine or use plant clips to attach the stem at intervals. Those little clips with teeth that grip the string are game changers. Before I found them, I'd accidentally snap stems while twisting them around twine every single year. For determinate varieties, those basic tomato cages actually work fine since the plants only reach 3 to 5 feet. You can also use a single sturdy stake per plant. Just make sure whatever support you choose is in place early, before the plant gets too big to manage. Even cherry tomatoes in containers need support. Their individual fruits might be small, but when you've got clusters of 50 tiny tomatoes hanging off branches, that weight adds up fast. A central stake in the pot gives you something to tie branches to as they start drooping under the load. Supporting early means stronger plants, no broken stems, and way less stress for you during the growing season. It takes 10 minutes at planting time and saves you hours of frustration later. Growing tomatoes really comes down to energy management. Every step we covered directs your plant's power toward fruit production instead of wasting it on unnecessary leaves and stems. Start using these techniques now and watch your harvest explode.
If you found value in this video, you're going to love this next one.